They were taken from him too quickly. James still remembered that fateful day. The out-of-control truck, the screeching of tires, the sharp gasp before everything went dark. When he woke up in the hospital, the first thing he saw was a cold, sterile ceiling. The second was the doctor's sorrowful gaze. "We're so sorry," just 3 words, and his world collapsed. From that moment on, James Walker was no longer whole. It took him years to accept the truth. There were days when he wondered if there was any point in continuing to live. But somehow, he forced himself to keep going. He couldn't let Sarah and Michael down. He told himself, "They would want me to keep going." James tried to rebuild his life. He found a job as a night security guard at a small office building. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to rent a tiny apartment and give him some sense of stability. But life was never fair. 2 years ago, his body started betraying him. The chest pains became more frequent. Sometimes he felt lightheaded. His heart would race unexpectedly. At first he ignored it. A soldier like him didn't have the luxury of being weak. But then, one night on duty, he collapsed. When he woke up in the hospital this time, he had lost more than just his health. He lost his job. No security company wanted to hire a man with a heart condition. He was too old, too frail to handle demanding physical work. And so his life spiraled downward. Medical bills piled up, his pension and assistance weren't enough to cover them. His savings dwindled faster than he could have imagined. And in the end, he lost the only place he could call home. Don't assume this is just another heartwarming tale. What you are about to witness will shock you, surprise you, and make you think. James Walker once had everything: a warm home, a loving wife, a bright, kind-hearted son, a stable job, a simple yet fulfilling life. But now, all that remained was a tattered backpack, a faded military ID, and a worn-out photograph, one that had barely withstood the test of time. That photograph had once been his greatest treasure. It captured the happiest moment of his life, a peaceful Sunday afternoon when the 3 of them strolled through the park together. Sarah, his wife, her radiant smile shining like the sun, and Michael, his little boy, wrapped around his neck, giggling with pure joy. It was an ordinary day, nothing particularly special, but to James it was everything. It was a moment he had thought he would hold on to forever. But then, in the span of a single reckless mistake by a drunk driver, everything vanished. What happened next would be something no one expected. Because this isn't just a story about a homeless man receiving help. It's a story about a seemingly small decision, one that would change everything. Barron Trump. And in that instant, James recognized him. Just a few steps away, surrounded by a circle of men in black suits, a tall teenager walked with steady strides. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't glued to his phone. He didn't avoid eye contact. There was something striking about his presence, something that set him apart from the faceless crowd. Until today. But James was not a beggar. He had never stretched out his hand to ask for money. James Walker, 62 years old, a former soldier who had served for 22 years. Now all he had left was a battered backpack, a faded military ID, and a past no one cared to remember. Last night, he endured the freezing temperatures without so much as a blanket. Today, his stomach was so empty he couldn't even recall the last time he had a proper meal. New York, 6 a.m. The sun had yet to burn away the morning mist, and the biting cold forced people to bury their faces in their coats, hurrying along without looking back. But amidst it all, one man stood still, clutching his thin jacket tightly, his eyes watching the indifferent crowd rush past him. An old soldier, a wealthy teenager, and a single dollar. 3 things that seemed completely unrelated, yet, in a single fateful moment, they intertwined, forever changing both of their lives. He had once thought losing Sarah and Michael was the worst thing that could ever happen to him. But he was wrong. There was another kind of pain. Living in a world where you no longer had a place to belong. New York was not a city for the weak. For the homeless, every single day was a battle. James quickly learned how to survive. He found places with less wind to sleep at night. He knew which soup kitchens served food in the morning. He kept himself as clean as possible, making sure he never became a burden in anyone's eyes. But there was one thing he had never done: ask for money. Pride was the only thing he had left. There were nights when hunger gnawed at his stomach so violently that he couldn't sleep. There were mornings so cold that his fingers turned numb, nearly frozen. But still, he never stretched out his hand to beg. He was a soldier, a husband, a father, a man with dignity. He refused to see himself as a beggar. But today was different. New York's morning chill was harsh, turning every breath into mist. People rushed past, wrapped in expensive coats, eyes focused straight ahead, too preoccupied with their own lives. They didn't see him. They never did. James was used to it. He had long accepted being invisible to the world around him. But today, something felt different. Someone had seen him. New York's morning was just as loud, just as frantic as every other day. But for James Walker, today felt different. The icy wind cut through him as he curled up on a piece of worn cardboard. His thin, tattered coat was useless against the cold gusts sweeping between the towering skyscrapers. His stomach twisted, an unrelenting hunger gnawing at him since the night before. In his pocket, exactly 27 cents. He had counted that money more times than he could remember, every time hoping that by some miracle, when he opened his palm, there would be an extra coin, a tiny offering from some passing stranger's unintentional generosity. But miracles never came. New York was not a city for those who waited on miracles. The crowd flowed past him, moving like an unstoppable tide. Each person had somewhere to be. A meeting, a late breakfast, another busy workday. No one looked down. No one saw him. James had long since grown accustomed to his invisibility. But today, something was different. A ripple of murmur spread through the air, quick and infectious, like dry grass catching fire. A small crowd had begun gathering just a few steps away. Phones were raised. People paused, turning toward something, toward someone. James squinted toward the commotion, but the shifting bodies of the onlookers blocked his view. And then he saw them. Dark figures moved in seamless coordination, precise, disciplined, trained. A security detail. Men in black suits, sunglasses, earpieces barely visible behind their ears. Their movements were intentional, not random. James didn't need to guess. He recognized this kind of security. This was elite protection, reserved only for the most powerful. Then he saw him. A tall young man, his golden hair catching the wind. His face was composed, far more so than one would expect from someone his age. Barron Trump. James had never cared for politics. He never followed White House debates, never paid attention to the media frenzy surrounding powerful families. But that face, the one that had appeared on news outlets and magazine covers, was unmistakable. This wasn't a businessman, not a politician, not a billionaire, just a 17-year-old boy. And yet, he carried the weight of a name too heavy for most to bear. James watched him, and suddenly his heart pounded, not out of fear, not out of intimidation, but for an entirely different reason. Because in that moment, as he looked at Barron Trump, he saw someone else. The young man's face blurred, dissolving into another. A boy, 14 years old. Bright, eager eyes, a mischievous, playful grin. Michael. His son. James felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. How was this possible? Barron looked nothing like Michael. He was taller, his hair was lighter, and yet there was something about his eyes, a depth of thought, a seriousness beyond his years. It was exactly the way Michael used to look when he was lost in thought, working through a difficult problem. James swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. Michael, 10 years old, running into his arms when James returned from deployment. Michael, 12 years old, grinning proudly after scoring his first goal at a school soccer match. Michael, 14 years old, sitting at the dinner table, twirling a pencil between his fingers as he struggled through a math problem. His son, taken from him too soon. James had lost Michael, and now, staring at Barron Trump, he saw a shadow of his son in the young man before him. Something deep inside him stirred. For the first time in months, something long buried clawed its way to the surface, a desperate, aching need for connection. His hands clenched into fists, his breathing turned unsteady. And then a voice, soft but firm, whispered in his mind. Sarah's voice. Hold on to your pride, James. Never beg. He had lived by that promise, even when he lost his job, even when he had to sleep on the streets, even when hunger twisted like a knife inside him. He had never asked for anything. But now, his stomach was empty. His body trembled from the cold. and before him stood a boy who reminded him of the son he would never see again. Maybe that was why. For the first time in years, James spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Could you spare $1?" It wasn't a plea, not a desperate cry for help, just a simple question. But within it carried everything he had left. A fractured pride, a quiet despair, a fragile hope that someone might finally see him. The world seemed to slow. The movement of the city, unstoppable, uncaring, suddenly paused. The security guards reacted instantly, muscles tensed. One of them stepped forward, his hand resting subtly on the grip of his concealed weapon. Another pressed a hand to his earpiece, likely preparing to call for backup. To them, James was a threat. But Barron Trump? He didn't move. He had stopped, and for a fleeting, weighty moment, their eyes met. A homeless veteran, a billionaire's son, two people from opposite worlds. James had no way of knowing it yet, but what happened next would change everything. Silence engulfed the street. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, but to James it felt like an eternity. The moment his words escaped his lips, the moment he uttered, "Could you spare $1?" the air around him seemed to freeze. The security team reacted immediately. One of them, tall and built like a fortress, took a single step forward, his hand subtly shifting toward the concealed firearm at his hip. Another raised a hand to his earpiece, signaling for an update, possibly calling for backup. To them, this was no ordinary situation. A homeless man suddenly approaching Barron Trump. This wasn't just a security concern. It was the kind of moment that could make headlines across the country in an instant. But before anyone could take further action, Barron raised his hand. A sharp, decisive motion, a silent command, and just like that, everything stopped. Barron Trump stood there, taller than the men assigned to protect him. At just 17, he possessed an eerie calmness, a quiet kind of power that did not stem from wealth or status, but from something far greater, an unshakable confidence. He turned his gaze toward James. It was not the look of a wealthy young man observing the poor, not pity, not discomfort, but the look of someone who truly saw another human being. He said nothing at first. Seconds passed in heavy silence. Then finally his voice, calm, measured, yet deeper than expected for someone his age, broke through the stillness. "Are you a veteran?" James couldn't believe his ears. No one had ever asked him that before. No one had ever stopped to notice the faded military ID clipped to his tattered coat. No one had ever cared enough to wonder who he used to be or what he had once given for his country. But this boy did. James swallowed, his throat dry from shock. Slowly, he nodded. A cold gust of wind swept through the street, causing Barron's hair to shift slightly. But he didn't move. He didn't ask any further questions. He didn't offer empty sympathy. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. At first, James thought he was about to call someone from his family, but he was wrong. Barron's fingers moved swiftly across the screen. Then, he lifted the phone to his ear. His expression didn't change. His voice remained composed, calm, but sharp now, like someone who had already made up his mind. "Connect me to the property management office at the tower, immediately." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. More people began to realize who was standing in the middle of the street. Phones were raised, cameras rolling. People whispered, their curiosity turning into something deeper, something close to awe. But the strangest thing was, no one interrupted him. Not even his security detail, men trained to act without hesitation. They knew one thing. Barron Trump never acted on impulse. James felt as though he was dreaming. An hour ago, he had been just another, whether invisible figure on the streets of New York, a homeless man, a forgotten soul. And now he was watching one of the most powerful teenagers in America make a phone call, not to have him removed, but to change something. After a few seconds, a voice on the other end answered. But Barron didn't wait for pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "I need to know if there's an available room at the hotel." "Not for me. Can it be arranged immediately?" There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of pages flipping. "Yes, sir, there is a room available." "Good. Book it now and send the details to my number." And with that, he hung up. The crowd fell into stunned silence. James sat frozen. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. But Barron wasn't finished. Without hesitation, he made another call. I have a former military officer here with security experience. Check if there's a position available at Trump Tower. I need confirmation within the hour." The voice on the other end stammered. Yes, Mr. Barron. We'll look into it immediately." James still couldn't process it. How had his life just shifted so drastically? A minute ago, he had been preparing for another night on the freezing streets. Now, someone was booking him a hotel room. Someone was finding him a job. And that someone was a 17-year-old boy. Barron turned back to James as if choosing his next words carefully. Then, in the same composed voice, he said, "There's a hotel room waiting for you. It's covered for the next month, no charge." James swallowed hard. "There's an open position at Trump Tower for a security consultant. It's mostly office work, steady pay, stable hours." James's hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding. "I also contacted the VA hospital. They'll be expecting you tomorrow morning for a full medical evaluation." The world around James spun. He could hardly breathe. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. Why was this happening? Why him? His voice cracked as he finally managed to whisper, "Why? Why are you doing this?" Barron didn't look away. He held James's gaze, steady, unwavering. Then, in a tone that left no room for doubt, he spoke. "Because someone once told me, if we have the ability to help and we choose not to, then what kind of people are we?" James let out a shaky laugh, a broken sound, somewhere between disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Because those were the exact words his son, Michael, had once said to him so many years ago. James drew in a deep breath, but his voice still trembled. "My son used to say the same thing." Barron's lips curled into the faintest smile. James didn't know what lay ahead for him now. But one thing was certain, today was no ordinary day. Today was the day his life changed forever. That night, for the first time in years, James Walker didn't have to sleep on the freezing sidewalk. He stepped into the hotel room that Barron had arranged for him. As the door closed behind him, he slowly reached out and touched the blanket on the bed. It was just a simple bed, but to James it was a symbol of something much greater. A new life. He set his worn-out backpack on the floor and unzipped it. Inside, his old photograph of Sarah and Michael was still there. Its edges frayed, but their faces as clear as the day it was taken. James sat down on the bed, staring at the photo, a wave of emotion swelling in his chest, too deep to name. For 10 years, he had lived with the belief that he was a man who had lost everything. His family, his job, his home, his faith in humanity. But tonight, he realized he had been wrong. He still had something more valuable than anything else, a chance to start over. The next morning, when he woke up in the warmth of the hotel room, it took him a moment to recognize that everything around him was real. He was no longer curled up on the sidewalk, no longer trembling from hunger, no longer carrying the crushing weight of being invisible to the world. After breakfast, his first real meal in days, James made his way to the VA hospital, just as Barron had arranged. The doctors were already expecting him. They performed a full medical examination, carefully assessing his condition, and designed a treatment plan to help strengthen his weakened heart. James couldn't remember the last time someone had truly cared about his health. But today, everything was different. A few days later, James stepped into Trump Tower. He was still the same man, but he was no longer the homeless veteran Barron had met on the street. He wore a simple yet well-fitted suit, provided by the hotel. His hair was neatly trimmed. His old, tattered shoes had been replaced with a modest new pair. Not expensive, but at least they weren't falling apart. Most importantly, there was something on his face that hadn't been there for a long time. Pride. He no longer felt like someone who had been cast aside. He was a person. A man who had served his country. A man who still had something to contribute. And today, he had a job. The job that Barron had taken the time to arrange for him. James Walker was now a security consultant for Trump Tower. He no longer had the strength to stand guard for 12-hour shifts as he once had. But with over 2 decades of military experience, he knew exactly what it took to protect an important building. His role was simple but critical. Training younger security officers, teaching them the principles of protection that only a man who had been on the battlefield could understand. James had never imagined that his life could return to any sense of normalcy. But today he had a reason to wake up in the morning. And it had all started with a single question. Could you spare $1? But instead of a single dollar, Barron had given him dignity, recognition, and most importantly, a second chance. A chance James had thought he would never have again. A week later, James was sitting in his office at Trump Tower when there was a knock at the door. He looked up, and standing there was Barron Trump. The same composed demeanor, but today there was something different. A warmth behind his smile. James stood and firmly shook the young man's hand. "Thank you, Barron." Barron shook his head slightly. "You don't need to thank me. You took your life back on your own. I just opened the door." James nodded, but his voice still caught in his throat. "Still, I'm grateful." Barron held his gaze, his expression steady, his eyes carrying a depth beyond his years. If we have the ability to help, and we choose not to, then what kind of people are we? James chuckled softly. "My son used to say the same thing." Barron's smile grew slightly. "Then maybe he was like you, someone who doesn't see the world just as it appears, but through how people treat each other." James didn't say anything else. He simply smiled, his heart full in a way it hadn't been for years. Because for the first time in a long time, he knew that his son would be proud of him. Does this story make you think? Somewhere out there, there may be many others like James Walker. People who once had everything, only to lose it all. But sometimes all it takes is one opportunity, one act of kindness, one person willing to see them for everything to change. That day, Barron Trump didn't just give away a single dollar. He gave something far greater. A renewed sense of dignity, a recognition of humanity, and a path forward for a man who had been forgotten by the world. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an act of kindness that changed someone's life? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and share it to spread this story to others. Hit subscribe so you never miss another inspiring story. See you in the next story that touches the heart, because sometimes even the smallest act of kindness can change everything.